Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. Story 1. I learned quickly that when the Alaska Railroad engine whistles, it doesn't matter if it's midnight. You stop and listen. Out here, 80 miles north of Seward, tucked into this valley where the Chugach Mountains start to look like giant, frozen teeth, that whistle is the only sound that cuts through the wilderness and means people. I'd been alone in this old logging cabin for 3 weeks. My job, supposedly, was to monitor water quality in the Resurrection Creek, a stupid, bureaucratic title for guy who drinks bad coffee and tries not to get eaten by bears. It paid for my schooling, so I didn't complain, not out loud anyway. The cabin was a rotting hulk of spruce logs and bad decisions. No phone, no internet, just a satellite radio that only picked up static and the occasional preacher screaming about hellfire. I liked the silence at first. Now the silence felt heavy, like wet snow. The night the whistling stopped, everything changed. It was 2:17 a.m. I know the time because I was staring at the glowing hands of my Casio watch, trying to convince myself I wasn't scared of the dark. I was wide awake, the wind a low, constant moan outside. The train usually hits this stretch between 2 and 2:35 a.m. heading north. I always hear it build for 5 minutes, the roar of the diesel growing, then the brief, beautiful scream of the horn as it crosses the old trestle bridge 3 miles east. Tonight it started fine. I heard the low bass thrum, the rhythmic clack 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 on the rails. Then nothing, not the horn, not the roar, just gone, cut off as if someone had snipped the world's power cord. I sat up, the thin sleeping bag sliding to my hips. My heart was already knocking against my ribs like a trapped bird. A derailment. It happened sometimes. If it was, the crew would have a satellite phone. They'd be walking the tracks, maybe even heading my way for the first light source they could find. I waited 5 minutes, 10. The wind kept its steady, mindless sigh. I got out of bed. The floorboards, even the ones I knew were solid, seemed to groan under my weight. I grabbed the old, heavy-duty spotlight, the kind that takes a dozen D batteries and feels like a weapon, and my small hatchet. Maybe I was being dramatic, but in Alaska, you don't wait to find out if you're right. I pulled on my worn jeans, a thick wool sweater, and my boots. The silence outside was absolute now, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of things that shouldn't be there. I stepped outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow, a quick, sharp pain in my lungs. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind a thick blanket of fast-moving clouds, turning the mountains into menacing black shapes. I shone the light, a brilliant white cone, into the trees, nothing but spruce, alder, and shadows. My cabin sits maybe a quarter-mile from the creek. The path is just a faint, muddy track. I started walking toward the tracks, forcing myself to take slow, deliberate breaths. It's just the cold seizing up the engine, I told myself, or the conductor fell asleep and coasted to a stop. Lying to yourself is a necessary survival skill. When I reached the railway line, I stopped dead. The tracks were still, 2 shining parallel lines disappearing into the dark, silent forest. There were no lights, no sound of an engine idling, but what caught my breath wasn't the absence of the train, it was the mud. The ballast, the crushed rock bed under the tracks, was wet, not damp with dew, but saturated, thick and shiny, as if a small flood had just passed through. The ground here is usually frozen solid or at least dry, especially this high up, but this was like walking on a sponge. I turned the spotlight west, the direction the train had been coming from. 100 yards away, the beam caught it. The train wasn't derailed, it wasn't stopped, it was gone. Just the tracks, leading into an empty space. Wait, no. I lowered the light, trembling. About 50 feet ahead, something was wrong with the tracks themselves. The rails, steel beams designed to support hundreds of tons, were buckled. They didn't look bent from an impact, they looked peeled, like someone had taken a gigantic can opener and curled the steel inward. And then I saw the scrape marks. Massive gouges in the wet earth, starting maybe 30 feet west of the buckled rail, leading off the track, directly into the heavy spruce trees that lined the forest edge. They were too wide for a snow machine, too deep for a bear, and perfectly parallel, like something with enormous, heavy feet had walked sideways off the track. Did the engine fall off? No. A locomotive falling off the tracks makes a sound that shakes the earth. And where were the cars? Where was the mess? I took a step closer to the tracks. That's when I heard it, a small, wet squelch. I pointed the light down and I almost dropped it. Imprinted perfectly in the soaked ballast was a boot print. Not a heavy work boot like mine, but a slender hiking boot. Deeply pressed, like the person carrying the weight was moving fast or carrying a tremendous load. I followed the print with my light. It headed straight for the gouges in the mud and then vanished into the darkness of the trees. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow valley. The smell of the air wasn't pine or frost anymore. It was something metallic, coppery. It smelled like blood or maybe just fresh, turned up earth, but my mind was already racing. Someone was on that train. Where did the train go? Why were the rails peeled? And whose print is that? I turned back to the south where the tracks came from. I shone the light down the shining steel. It went on and on, perfect and straight. Nothing. I was alone, standing on a swampy railroad track in the middle of a killer-silent Alaskan night, with evidence that something unimaginably heavy had been pulled, not fallen, into the woods. I forced myself to walk toward the gouges. My boots sank into the wet earth. The metallic scent was stronger here. The trees were dense. I didn't want to go in there. Every cell in my body was screaming, run. I aimed the light into the thick shadows. The beam cut maybe 20 feet before being swallowed by the darkness. Hello, my voice sounded thin, pathetic. Is anyone there, train crew? Only the wind answered, sighing a cold, terrible promise. I scanned the ground at the edge of the woods. The soil here was completely churned up, and then I saw it, snagged on the jagged edge of a broken spruce branch, a piece of fabric. I reached out and pulled it free. It was a piece of cheap polyester uniform, the color of faded denim. It was heavy, soaked with the strange, coppery-smelling water. And at the edge where it had ripped, the fibers were stained a deep, alarming crimson. This wasn't an accident. This was a snatch. The terror finally hit me, cold and overwhelming. I wasn't scared of a bear or a moose. I was scared of something that could stop 100 tons of locomotive dead silent, buckle the tracks, and leave only a frantic boot print and a piece of bloodied uniform heading into the black. I clutched the fabric. Why go to the woods? If they were injured, they'd follow the track back to the light, unless whatever pulled them off, the rails was still in there. I took one shuddering step back, my eyes fixed on the impenetrable dark wall of the forest. The wind shifted again, and this time the scent was undeniable, a sharp, sickening smell like old meat mixed with iron. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. Was it an animal that size? What kind? Or was it something worse? And if someone survived the initial attack, are they still alive inside those trees? I turned, stumbling slightly, and ran. I didn't run back to the cabin, which felt too exposed, too isolated. I ran along the tracks, the way the print had not gone, toward the only thing that felt solid, the trestle bridge 3 miles away. Maybe there would be a service phone, a small maintenance shed, anything. As I ran, my own footsteps echoing on the slick rails, I couldn't shake the image of the steel tracks peeled back, and the knowledge that something enormous had been taken. And it had taken a piece of me, my sanity, my sense of safety, with it. I glanced over my shoulder one last time. From this distance, the gouges looked like a dark, open mouth. And for a heart-stopping second, I thought I saw a light, a single, flickering point of yellow, deep within the trees, moving. Did I imagine that? Or is someone with a lantern looking for me, or looking for their next meal? I didn't stop to find out. The only thing louder than my pounding heart was the silent, massive question mark hanging over the empty tracks. The night had just begun. Story 2. They say up here, winter doesn't just arrive, it locks the door behind you. For me, that door slammed shut on the Dalton Highway, 100 miles south of Deadhorse, and the key was swallowed by a blizzard. I was running cheap pharmaceuticals from Fairbanks up to the North Slope oil fields. Stupid money, lethal risk. Everyone on the ice road knows the game. You make the run in 2 days, you make 5 figures. You stop, you freeze, or worse, someone stops you. My rig was a beat-up Freightliner, engine whining like a sick dog. The blizzard hit around 8 p.m., a whiteout so thick my high beams looked like they were shining into milk. I pulled over just past a chain-up station, a tiny, unused pull-off that usually smells like diesel and sweat. Tonight, it smelled like nothing but cold and fear. I had 48 hours to deliver. I was already 3 hours behind. The cargo was not mine. It belonged to a man named Silas, and Silas collected debts not with lawyers but with bone saws. I tried to call him, but the sat phone was dead. Frozen battery, I figured. My nerves were vibrating. Sitting in that cab, listening to the wind try to tear the chrome off the truck, I started going over the math. If I waited it out, I was dead. If I drove blind, I'd ditch the rig and be dead slightly faster. Around 10 p.m., the wind settled into a low, mournful drone. I cracked the door, peering out. The snow had eased to a fine, steady curtain. I figured I could drive slow, maybe 10, 15 miles an hour, until I hit the next mile marker. That's when I saw the second set of lights. Not headlights. These were smaller, weaker, just 2 soft, yellow cones about a half-mile back, tucked right behind a small ridge. They weren't moving, they were just watching. The blood went cold in my veins. Nobody parks on the Dalton in a blizzard unless they're broken down, or unless they're waiting. I killed my engine and my running lights. The sudden silence was deafening, a thick pressure in my skull. I didn't breathe. I just stared into the rearview mirror, trying to see shape, model, anything in those 2 faint spots of yellow. Is it Silas? He knew my route. He knew my schedule. If he thought I was stalling, he'd send his cleaners. I waited 10 minutes. The yellow lights didn't move. My only weapon was a heavy, rusty lug wrench I kept under the bunk. I slid it out, the cold steel burning my palm. If I drive, they follow. If I stay, they walk. I had to see who it was. If it was a cop or a civilian, fine. If it was Silas's crew, big, silent men who liked knives, I needed a head start. I slipped on my parka, grabbed the wrench, and slid out of the cab. The air instantly sucked the heat out of me. It was maybe minus 35 degrees. Every breath was a painful sting. I moved along the side of the truck, using the massive tires for cover, pressing myself against the frigid metal. I had maybe 200 yards to the rise where those lights were hovering. The snow was calf-deep and uneven. I moved slow, silent, my boots crunching just loud enough to make me wince. When I got to the top of the ridge, I dropped into a squat behind a drift. I looked down. The lights belonged to an old, beat-up snowmobile. It was facing my direction, engine off, but the person on it was facing away, toward the sheer, frozen cliff face on the opposite side of the road. This didn't look like Silas. Silas's men drove black SUVs or big, new pickups. The person was bundled up in a thick, faded orange survival suit. They looked small. They were just sitting there, perfectly still. I watched for a full minute, my muscles screaming from the cold. Then I saw it. The person in the orange suit moved their arm. Slowly, deliberately, they dipped their hand into the snowbank beside the snowmobile. Not digging, just dropping something in. What are they doing? Are they stashing something? Curiosity, that stupid, dangerous human flaw, pulled me down the hill. I moved toward the snowmobile, keeping low. When I was 20 feet away, I got my answer. It wasn't a person, it was a mannequin. A life-sized store window mannequin dressed in a high-vis orange suit propped up on the snowmobile seat. Its head was tipped back, the cheap plastic face painted with a fixed, vacant smile. Its plastic hand was indeed dipped into the snow, and sitting on the ground beside its boot was a small, battery-powered emergency lantern. That was the yellow light. My relief was immediate, dizzying, but it lasted less than a second. Because sitting on the snowmobile seat, tucked between the mannequin's legs, was a small, military-style backpack, and taped to the backpack was a crisp, white piece of paper. I approached the snowmobile, my heart now hammering with a new, different kind of dread. This is a setup. I reached out and ripped the paper off the bag. It wasn't a note, it was a photograph. A picture of me. A close-up, high-quality picture, taken maybe a month ago, standing outside the Fairbanks diner I always stopped at. I was holding a coffee, squinting at the sun. Below the photo, scrawled in thick black marker, were 5 words. "You're late, time is up." My breath hitched. They knew I was here, they knew I was running, and this wasn't a warning, it was a taunt. I whirled around, clutching the photo, my eyes sweeping the white darkness. If the snowmobile is the decoy, where are they? I looked back up the ridge toward my truck. The black silhouette was massive against the pale sky. And then I saw it. A tiny movement right at the back of my trailer where the cargo doors are sealed. A subtle glint, maybe from a buckle or a zipper. Someone was on my truck. They hadn't been waiting for me to drive. They had been waiting for me to leave the cab. They knew the blizzard would force me to pull over. They used the dummy and the lights to draw me out and send me on a 200-yard detour, guaranteeing me enough distance to make them comfortable climbing on the back. Silas didn't want the drugs. Silas wanted me. I didn't try to climb the hill. I tore off the lug wrench and scrambled back toward the road, a panicked animal. How long have they been there? How many of them? I was maybe 50 feet from my rig when the cargo door seal, a heavy steel bar, was violently ripped open from the inside. The sound was a loud, tearing screech of metal against metal, impossibly loud in the white silence. A figure, enormous and dark against the pale interior of the trailer, dropped to the ground. He was wearing black gear, a full-face balaclava, and carrying something long and heavy that wasn't a gun. It was a straight-edged shovel, the kind used for breaking ice, with a heavy, sharp blade. He didn't look at me first. He looked at the snowmobile, confirming his decoy worked. Then he turned his head slowly. "You should have stayed put, boy," a low, gravelly voice echoed. The voice was distorted by the mask, but the intent was clear. I didn't speak. I just threw the wrench with everything I had. It spun end over end, a heavy projectile, and hit him square on the chest. It barely made him stagger. I pivoted and ran hard, not back toward the snowmobile, but off the road, toward the vast, empty, frozen tundra. My only chance was to lose him in the uneven terrain, buy time, and hope my truck's location gave me a better chance than standing next to it. I burst through a deep drift. My lungs were burning, my legs numb. I could hear his heavy, rhythmic footsteps behind me, the shovel dragging slightly in the snow. He's not fast, but he's relentless. I glanced back. He was silhouetted against the diffused light of the blizzard, a huge, terrifying hunter. He raised the shovel over his head, not aiming to strike, but aiming to throw. Is he going to try to pin me? I threw myself sideways just as the shovel left his hand. It whistled past my head, a terrifying blur of steel, and plunged into the snowbank 20 feet away, vibrating. I was lying in the snow, breathless, but I was alive. I scrambled to my feet. He was already walking toward the buried shovel. I need a weapon. I need to get back to the truck. I realized what he had done. He wasn't going to chase me into the cold. He was going to take the truck, the cargo, and leave me out here to freeze, a slow, agonizing, invisible death. I ran low, circling widely, trying to get back to the road and the truck before he did. When I finally reached the back of the Freightliner again, the man was already there, pulling the shovel out of the snow, looking satisfied. He saw me and started to smile under the mask. "Took the long way round, didn't ya?" I didn't stop. I ran straight at him, head down, and hit him square in the gut with my shoulder. It was like hitting a brick wall, but the impact, combined with the slick ice under his boots, made him grunt and stumble. The shovel clattered to the ground. I didn't fight. I grabbed the edge of the open cargo door, vaulted up, and scrambled inside the pitch-black trailer. I slammed the door shut, ignoring the pain in my fingers as I threw the heavy steel seal bar back into place. I could hear him yelling, a muffled roar, and then the heavy thud-thud-thud as he started kicking the outside of the door. I backed up into the darkness, crawling over the crated pharmaceuticals, breathing heavily. I'm locked in, but he's locked out. I pulled my sat phone out of my parka, the one I'd lied about being dead. I'd kept it off to save battery and avoid tracking. I turned it on now. I waited for the faint green light to appear, waited for the satellite lock. The kicking outside was getting louder, angrier. Finally, the light blinked green. I punched in the 3 numbers I knew would connect to a state trooper post. I heard the scrape of metal right outside my door, and a sickening thought hit me. He's going to find a way to cut through the aluminum. The trooper answered on the 3rd ring, "Dalton Highway Patrol." "I'm at the chain-up station south of Sag River," I gasped out. "I need help. Someone's trying to kill me." "Say again, where?" I pushed myself against the wall, listening to the heavy, labored grinding of metal just inches away. I knew that sound. He'd grabbed the shovel and was using the sharp edge to wedge open the door seal again. "Sag River, please, he's cutting the door." There was a pause on the line and the trooper's voice changed, dropping to a low, concerned tone. "Sir, you need to stay put. We're sending a unit. Tell me your name, please." I looked at the piece of photo I was still clutching, my face, the words, "You're late, time is up." "My name is." I took a deep, shuddering breath as the grinding outside suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, powerful hiss of compressed air. "He's found the air brakes." "My name is John," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper, "and I don't think I'm going to make it." The hiss stopped. The man outside said nothing. The silence was absolute. I knew he was just standing there, listening to me talk to the police. Then there was a sharp, loud crack from the passenger side of the cab. Not a kick, but the sound of something heavy, the shovel, smashing through the glass. I heard the crunch of boots on glass and I knew. He hadn't wanted the cargo. He hadn't wanted to cut me out. He just wanted to get inside the cab, start the engine and drive away with me locked in the box, heading toward a final, freezing delivery to Sela's. I threw the sat phone to the floor, scrambled back to the rear door seal, and ignoring the screams of the man inside the cab now trying to get the rig in gear, I ripped the seal open and plunged myself out of the truck, back into the deep, white darkness. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint blue flashers of the state trooper's SUV cresting the ridge an hour later, leaving the lights, the snowmobile, and the roaring, now moving Freightliner far behind me. I owed Sela's a truck and a load of drugs, but the debt I paid tonight was my freedom and my sanity. I never made another run. Story 3. I'd worked the crab boats out of Dutch Harbor for 5 years, but nothing prepares you for the deep, cold insanity of being stranded in a village called Kaktivik. It's way up on the north slope, a spit of land that stares across the Beaufort Sea, and it feels like the last place on Earth before you hit the black void of space. I was only there because the fishing season ended early and I took a construction gig for the winter, building a new utility shed. The pay was great, but the isolation was a sickness you caught in your bones. There are maybe 300 people here, mostly in Upiat, and they've got their own rhythm, their own history. And you, the outsider, you learn to keep your head down. The bad times always start when the ice fog rolls in. Not just regular fog, but tiny, sharp crystals of frozen air that turn the world into a blinding, silent gray box. You can't see 10 feet, and the cold drops like a hammer. It was Tuesday night, and the fog had been locked over us for 48 hours. I was in my tiny prefab housing unit, trying to coax some heat out of a dodgy electric radiator, when the first screams started. It was maybe 11:35 p.m. The sound was faint, muffled by the fog, but unmistakable, a raw, desperate human sound cut abruptly short. I froze. My cheap coffee mug clattered against the radiator. I've heard plenty of animal noises, bears, foxes, the roar of a seal, but that was a man and he was terrified. I live on the edge of the village, closest to the sea ice. The street lights, what few there are, were just dull, haloed orbs of yellow in the swirling gray. I pulled on my thermal gear, my heavy parka, and grabbed the only thing I owned that felt useful, a heavy-duty wrench from my toolkit. I didn't know if I was going to help someone or defend myself, but I couldn't just sit there. I stepped out. The fog instantly grabbed the air in my lungs. It was dead silent now. The silence after a scream is always worse than the scream itself. It means something finished the job. I walked toward where I thought the sound came from, the road that leads to the storage hangars. I moved slowly, feeling my way more than seeing it. What was it? A polar bear. They're common, they're deadly, but they're not silent. They leave tracks, they snort, they make noise. This felt cleaner somehow. I walked for maybe 3 minutes. That's when I saw the red in the fog. It was on the snow, about the size of a dinner plate, a deep, horrifying crimson that looked almost black in the faint light. It was already glazing over, freezing fast. Blood. Fresh. And right next to the blood there was a boot print. A heavy, industrial-sized work boot, like the kind I wear. But this print was pressed so deeply into the crusty snow that the wearer must have been incredibly heavy, or moving with powerful force. And the stride, it wasn't running. It was a long, deliberate walking stride, leading away from the blood, back toward the main cluster of houses. I knelt down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pressed my glove into the snow near the print. It felt firm, meaning this had happened maybe 5-10 minutes ago. If it was an animal attack, where's the body? Where's the struggle? I followed the tracks, walking slow, the wrench held like a lifeline. The tracks led me through the village square, past the dark shapes of the shuttered community hall and the general store. No one was awake. No lights were on. The whole village felt dead and preserved under a shroud of ice. The tracks stopped at the front steps of the old schoolhouse, a boarded-up building that hadn't seen a student in 20 years. Everyone knew it was a place for stray dogs and storage, nothing more. But the tracks didn't stop at the door. They led around the back, toward a set of steel double doors that everyone assumed were sealed shut. I swallowed, the air dry and cold in my throat. I edged around the corner of the building, my back against the rough wood siding. The steel doors were old, rusting, held shut by a heavy padlock and chain. Except the chain wasn't locked anymore. It was draped over the handle, and the padlock was lying on the ground. Not cut, but smashed. The brass casing was bent and split open like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. The steel doors were pulled slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches. The silence here was different. It wasn't just the fog-absorbing sound. It was a pressurized, held-breath silence. Do I go in? I'm an outsider. Getting involved in local matters, especially those that look like crime, is a death sentence in a place like this. But the blood, the sheer violence of that padlock, I couldn't walk away. I put my shoulder to the heavy door and pushed. It scraped loudly on the old concrete floor, a terrible, echoing screech. I shone my tiny flashlight into the blackness. It was an old gymnasium. Vast, cold, filled with the ghostly shapes of stacked desks, chairs, and old sports equipment. The air was heavy with the smell of mold, dust, and something else. That same coppery smell from the blood outside, but richer, more intense. "Hello," I whispered, my voice rattling like dry leaves. No answer, only the drip-drip of melting ice somewhere high in the ceiling. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me, not locked, just closed to keep the light contained. My flashlight beam danced across the far wall, and that's when I saw the artwork. Someone had been painting, not on canvas, on the wall. It was huge, maybe 15 feet across, a crude, terrifying depiction of a humanoid figure with long, grasping arms and a dark, empty space where its face should be. It looked like something from an old horror film. But that wasn't the worst part. The color was a deep, glossy brown red. It wasn't paint, it was blood. My stomach revolted. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. And then I saw the gift. Lying right in the center of the drawing, directly below where the figure's chest would be, was a small, perfectly wrapped present. It was wrapped in thick, brightly colored Christmas paper, the kind with Santa faces all over it, and tied with a neat silver bow. It was utterly out of place, an obscene beacon of cheer in a chamber of horrors. I kept the wrench tight in my hand and slowly walked toward it. The floor felt tacky under my boots. As I got closer, I noticed something else about the artwork. Around the edges of the blood painting, embedded in the drying gore, were thin, stiff strips of fabric. They looked like pieces of a parka, and attached to one strip was a small, plastic clip, the kind used to secure a laminated ID badge. I recognized the clip. It was from the security company that guarded the oil pipelines out here. The man who screamed, the security guard, he's been turned into this. I reached the gift. It was heavy, too heavy for a simple present. I didn't touch it, I only looked at it. The wrapping paper was slightly torn at one corner and through the rip. I saw something dark and slick underneath. And then, from the shadows in the rafters above, I heard a sound that made my spine turn to water. It was a soft, guttural sigh, a satisfied, quiet sound, like someone had just finished a long, hard job. I snapped the flashlight up, shining the powerful beam into the blackness above. I saw nothing at first, just the dusty network of old beams and heating pipes. Then the light caught two things. First, a pair of dull eyes reflecting the light like a cat, but set far too wide apart. Second, the flash of a white smile, a smile that was impossibly large, unnaturally wide, showing far too many teeth. It wasn't a person. It was hanging there, draped over the rafters, using its long, pale, muscled arms to grip the wood. It was wearing a dirty, hooded snowsuit, but the hood was pulled back, showing a face that was somehow too stretched, too thin, too happy. It hadn't moved, it was just watching me, waiting. I didn't scream, I didn't even breathe. It wanted me to find the gift. It's part of the ritual, the drawing, the blood, the offering. In one swift, desperate motion, I did the only thing I could think of. I spun around, brought the wrench up over my head, and slammed it down with all my strength onto the brightly wrapped box. The wrapping paper tore, the box collapsed, and a cloud of something fine and white erupted. The stench of iron and sulfur filled the air. And then I heard the sound I was hoping for, the high-pitched, furious shriek of the creature above. Whatever I had just ruined was important to it. I didn't wait to see what the gift was. I didn't try to look back up. I sprinted for the double doors, pulled them open, and scrambled out into the ice fog, pulling the doors shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was inside my little prefab. The door bolted, and my body shaking so hard I could barely stand. The next morning, the ice fog had lifted. The sun was pale, weak, but present. I walked back to the schoolhouse. The blood was still there, but now it was frozen hard, an ugly brown stain. The smashed padlock lay on the steps. But the steel doors were locked. Not just closed, but locked with a new, heavy-duty silver chain and a brand-new, enormous steel padlock. The bootprints were gone, swept away by a light dusting of new snow. I didn't report it. What would I say? That a grinning, blood-smeared cryptid was painting murals with a security guard in an abandoned school. I packed my bags that day. I left the wrench, but I took the lesson. Up here, the monsters don't need the dark to hunt, they just need the fog. I never found out what was in the gift, but I didn't need to. I saw the empty, terrified look of the dead man reflected in the snow. Story 4. I came to Alaska to disappear. That was the whole point. I drove the old pickup until the road literally ended outside Palmer, traded it for a beat-up snowmobile, and followed a frozen trapline 40 miles into the Chugach foothills. I found the cabin exactly where the sketchy map said it was, perched above the Nick River Valley, hidden by a stand of twisted birch. It wasn't a cozy writer's retreat. It was a squatter's den, bare walls, a leaky stovepipe, and a heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. But it was remote, and no one knew my new name, Frank. It was perfect. I'd been there 6 weeks when the paranoia started to set in. It wasn't about the why I was hiding. That was just a city mistake, a debt that would kill me if they found me. This was about the cabin itself. The first thing was the nail. I was splitting wood outside one afternoon when I noticed it, hammered halfway into the doorframe, right at eye level. It was new, shiny, and bent slightly, as if someone had tried to hang something heavy on it and then given up. I didn't put it there. I pulled it out and tossed it in the fire pit. 2 days later, the nail was back. Not the old one, but a new, identical nail, hammered halfway into the exact same spot on the doorframe. I stared at it for a full minute, the breath catching in my throat. Did a squirrel do this? No, it was driven in with a hammer deliberately. I started checking the perimeter of the cabin obsessively. The snow was 2 feet deep, hard-packed. I was the only one who'd walked the last mile of trail. My tracks were the only tracks. The terror wasn't immediate. It was a slow, sickening burn of how and why. Someone was watching me, or someone was sending a message. Then came the nights. The stove was a greedy thing. I had to get up around 3 a.m. every night to stoke the fire, or the cabin would be freezing by dawn. Last night when I woke up, the darkness was absolute. The embers in the stove were just faint, dying orange eyes. I grabbed my flashlight off the windowsill. That's when I felt the draft. A bitter, cold current of air slicing across my bare feet. It wasn't the usual draft from the door or the window cracks. This was coming from under the floorboards. I shone the light down. The cabin was built on timber pilings, set maybe 2 feet off the ground. The floorboards were old and rough cut, and one board right by the stove was loose. I pressed on it with my toe. It shifted, scraping against its neighbor. How long has it been loose? Why didn't I notice? I knelt down, gripping the edge of the board. I was sweating despite the cold. If someone had been here, if they had hidden something, this was where they'd do it. I pulled. The board groaned, resisted, and finally came free with a loud crack. I aimed the flashlight into the black, shallow cavity below the floor. Dust, cobwebs, old pine needles. Nothing. I was about to replace the board when the light beam flickered over a small, bright object pushed against the dirt. It was a small, plastic keychain, the kind with a clear plastic window and a piece of paper inside. It was filthy, but I could make out the paper. It was a claim ticket for a dry cleaner from Chicago. My old life, my old state where they were. I dropped the flashlight. It rolled, the beam spinning frantically, casting dizzying, strobe-like shadows on the walls. How could that be here? No one who lived in the valley, no hunter, no trapper, goes to Chicago dry cleaners. This was proof. They knew where I was. They had been here. I scrambled back from the hole, heart hammering against my ribs. I snatched up the flashlight. I slammed the floorboard back down. It didn't fit right now. I shoved a chair over it, then my heavy pack. It didn't matter. The barrier was gone. I sat on the edge of the cot, shivering, staring at the door. I knew I couldn't stay. If they found the cabin, they'd find me. But the night was a black, impossible wall. I had to wait for first light. I didn't sleep. Every groan of the timber, every whistle of the wind down the stovepipe was a footstep. At 5 a.m., the first weak gray light started to seep through the window. It was maybe minus 10 degrees F outside. I was getting ready to throw my gear into the sled when I noticed the window. It was a single pane, old and warped. A thick layer of condensation had frosted over the inside, obscuring the view. But right in the center of the glass, the frost was cleared away. A perfectly circular, small patch just big enough to see out of. It was clear and wet, like someone had pressed a warm cheek against the glass or used their breath to melt the ice. And looking in through that perfectly clean circle in the faint, pale morning light was a single black eyeball. I didn't scream. My chest seized up. It was a man's eye, wide open, unblinking, black as oil, framed by the frosty, distorted glass. It was pressed so hard against the window it looked flat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I knew if I moved, whatever was out there would know I saw it. We were locked in a staring match, the cold eye in me. Is it one of Silas's guys? Is he watching me pack? How long has he been there? Then slowly, agonizingly, the eye winked. It wasn't a friendly wink. It was a slow, malicious closing and opening of the lid, a silent confirmation. I see you, Frank, we found you. The eye pulled away. I lunged for the rifle I kept over the mantel. I threw the door open and burst outside, the cold air an instantaneous shock. I spun around, scanning the silent, empty stand of birch trees. The snow was untrodden, pure, pristine white. No tracks, not a single boot print leading away from the window. How could he vanish? I ran to the window. I pressed my face close to the clear circle. The steam of my breath immediately started to fog it up. I wiped it clean. I looked out. There was nothing. Just the white landscape, the frozen river far below, and the dark, quiet forest. I stared down at the ground immediately below the window, and there, pressed into the smooth, icy crust of the snow, was a perfect, small, almost delicate impression. It wasn't a boot. It was the imprint of a knee and a hand, like someone had been kneeling by the cabin wall, holding themselves up as they pressed their face to the glass. But the prints led to nowhere. They were isolated, a kneel and then nothing. No steps leading up to the spot, no steps leading away. It was as if the person had dropped from the sky to kneel there and then melted back into the air. My chest was heaving. This wasn't a hunter. This wasn't a debt collector. This was something else. Someone who moved in a way that defied the basic rules of physics and snow. I looked back at the cabin. The nail was still in the doorframe. The loose floorboard was covered. The Chicago keychain was still in my pocket. I knew the reality. They weren't just following me. They were playing with me, using the paranoia to break me down before they moved in. I grabbed my snowmobile keys. I abandoned the cabin, the stove, the food, everything. I pointed the machine down the trapline and drove. I kept looking in the rearview mirror until the birch trees were just a distant blur. I drove for 3 hours straight, running on pure adrenaline. When I finally hit the main highway, I stopped the snowmobile, gasping for breath. The sun was fully up now. I felt marginally safe. I pulled out the Chicago keychain and smashed the plastic with the heel of my glove. I tore out the slip of paper. It wasn't a dry cleaner. It was the address of the storage unit where I had hidden the cash I stole from them. But scrawled on the back of the ticket were 3 new words. "We checked, it's empty." I dropped the paper, horrified. They weren't after the cash anymore. They were just after me. And they were still out there, somewhere behind the mountains, watching the steam rise off the Nick River. Story 5. My name is Marcus. I'm a wildlife biologist, but for the last 3 months, I've been a babysitter for a telemetry station near Lake Iliamna. The work is mundane. Check the satellite link, log the data, and try not to get bored enough to talk to the ravens. My only company was a dog named Jasper, a mutt with one blind eye and an almost supernatural knack for knowing when the weather was about to turn ugly. The station cabin was small, built decades ago by the BLM. It sits a mile back from a tiny, iced-over airstrip, just a cleared patch of land that hasn't seen a plane in over a year. The problem wasn't the weather, it was the silence. The kind of silence that amplifies every tick of the stovepipe, every groan of the timbers, until the cabin starts to feel less like shelter and more like a resonant box designed to drive you mad. The first sign that things were wrong wasn't a sound, but a smell. It was a Monday night, maybe 1 a.m. I was asleep when Jasper started whining, a low, unhappy sound from his spot by the stove. I sat up listening. The wind was low, the air sharp. Then I smelled it, sweet, rich, and cloying. Like burnt sugar mixed with old, rusted copper. It was faint but distinct, seeping through the walls. "What is it, boy?" I mumbled, petting Jasper. He just whimpered and tucked his head under my arm. The smell intensified. It reminded me sickeningly of the meat-rendering plant I worked at one summer during college. I grabbed the big flashlight and went to the door. I unbolted the heavy latch slowly, cautiously. The moment the door cracked open, the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent with it. It wasn't outside. It was coming from the shed. The shed was a plywood shack 10 yards from the main cabin. I kept the fuel, tools, and critically, the sat phone repeater in there. I pulled on my boots and parka. Jasper whined again, but this time he didn't try to stop me. He huddled closer to the stove. The beam of my flashlight cut a nervous path through the snow. The snow was untouched, smooth and pristine. Nothing walked here. I reached the shed door. It was locked with a heavy carabiner clip, the way I left it. I unclipped the lock, my gloved hand shaking. The smell was overpowering now, thick and sickeningly sweet, hanging in the stagnant air inside the small shack. I swung the door open, ready to confront a leaking oil drum or a dead animal. I shone the light inside. The first thing I noticed was the floor. The wooden planks were slick, wet, and dark, not with oil or water, but with something viscous and deep brown. The second thing I noticed was the shelves. They were empty. All my fuel cans, the spare parts, the tools, everything was gone. The place was stripped. And the third thing, the thing that made me gasp and stumble back, was the repeater. The sat phone repeater, my only link to the outside world, was still there. But it had been dismantled, not broken, but carefully taken apart. The casing was unscrewed, the delicate circuit boards laid out on the bench like a surgeon's instruments, and the wires were snipped clean. On the workbench, next to the ruined electronics, was the source of the terrible smell. It was a small, crudely fashioned doll, made of wire, wrapped in strips of stained white fabric, its limbs tied with twine. Where its heart should have been, someone had inserted a chunk of raw, bloody liver. The heat from the shed had begun to rot it, producing that terrible, sweet stench. This isn't an animal, this is a person, and this is not a theft, it's a message. The shock was a physical blow. Someone had been here. They broke my communications, they stole my survival gear, and they left a sickening, ritualistic offering. I backed out, slammed the door shut, and ran back to the cabin. I bolted the door, throwing the heavy wooden bar across the frame. "Jasper, where were you?" I whispered, packing the small room. He just kept his blind eye on the stove and his good eye fixed on the door. I went to my meager supplies. My rifle was still there, leaning in the corner. Good, but without the repeater, I couldn't call for a supply drop or a pickup. I was marooned. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door. When did they come? How did they know I was here? And why the doll? The next 2 days were a blur of terror and hunger. I rationed my food and fuel, listening for the slightest sound. The cold was a constant, pressing enemy. On the third night, the tension peaked. It was 3 a.m. The wind had picked up, roaring around the cabin. I was checking the door bolt for the 10th time when I heard it. a rhythmic, faint thumping sound coming from the north, where the unused airstrip was. It wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't an engine, it was slower, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. I looked out the window. The moon was a frozen white disk. The airstrip was just a long, pale scar in the dark land. The thumping grew louder, closer. It was heavy, wet, and purposeful. I aimed my rifle at the door, my finger white on the trigger. What if they didn't leave? What if they're still here, waiting for me to weaken? Then the thumping stopped right outside the cabin wall. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears hurt. Silence. Then a slow, scraping sound like metal on wood. I aimed the rifle at the wall, near where the sound was. I waited. A low, guttural whisper came from right outside the wall, chillingly close, muffled by the timber but perfectly audible. "We brought the meat back, Marcus." I gasped. They knew my name. The whispering stopped. The scraping sound started again, and I heard a muffled clunk right outside the door. Then the rhythmic thump, thump, thump started again, receding into the darkness toward the airstrip. I waited until the sound was completely gone. I waited another hour just to be sure. Finally, at dawn, my hands numb with cold and fear, I slowly unbolted the door. I looked down. There was a pile of tools and fuel cans, all my stolen gear, neatly stacked by the door. Everything was back. But perched on top of the pile was another gift. A heavy, thick package wrapped in clean, brown butcher paper. And lying next to it, hammered into the top of my front step, was the liver doll from the shed. Only this time, the doll's arms were wrapped around a crude, bone-white tag. I reached out and carefully plucked the tag free. It was made of thick plastic, scratched and dirty. I turned it over. Scrawled onto the plastic with a black permanent marker were the words, "You can't call out, don't worry. We'll come back for the final delivery." I ripped open the butcher paper. Inside, wrapped in a thick layer of congealed fat, was a single, clean, perfectly packaged human kidney. My stomach heaved. The smell of the raw meat, the sickening sweetness of the shed, the knowledge that they had dismantled my life and then returned to drop off a part of their victim right on my doorstep. It was too much. I didn't try to fix the repeater. I didn't grab the fuel. I grabbed the rifle, 2 days' rations, and I started walking. I left everything, the cabin, the gear, the obscene gift behind. I walked toward the only thing I knew, the frozen Lake Iliamna. I walked not to safety, but away from the knowledge that I was being watched, monitored, and supplied by something that saw my isolation not as a coincidence, but as a perfect, sealed trap. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for the rhythmic, heavy thump, thump, thump of their return. I knew the waiting game was over. The game had just begun. Story 6. My name is Noah. I was supposed to be a hero, a search and rescue volunteer, the guy who flies into a whiteout to drag some lost tourist off a glacier. Now, I'm just the guy stuck in a borrowed firewatcher's shack south of Denali, hiding from the police and the bitter truth of what I failed to save. This shack is small, built on a rise overlooking a vast, frozen expanse of tundra. It has one window facing north, and the only radio is strictly weather-banned, useless for calling help. It's been 3 weeks since I saw another person. The nights here are the worst. They're not just dark, they're a deep, black pressure that feels like the world is pushing in on your skull. My routine was simple. Eat canned stew, chop wood, try not to think about the accident. And every night I fought the fear that I'd be found. The night the radio started talking, I knew I was already halfway to crazy. It was 1:45 a.m. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the hiss of the coal stove. The radio, perched on the shelf above my head, was tuned to the constant, low-grade static of the Weather Channel. Then the static stopped. It was replaced by a brief, sharp blast of white noise, followed by a voice. A voice so clear, so close, it felt like someone was standing right behind me. "Is that you, Noah?" I sat bolt upright, heart slamming against my ribs. I snatched the radio. The dial hadn't moved. The power was off, or it should have been. I hadn't touched the batteries in days. "Hello," I whispered, my voice cracked and dry. The voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of emotion, like a computer trying to mimic human speech. It wasn't coming from the speaker. It was coming from the radio chassis itself. "We know what you did, Noah. The snow doesn't hide it very well." I fumbled for the on-off switch. I twisted it hard. Nothing. The sound continued. "It's not broken, Noah. You can't turn us off." "Who is us? Is this a hoax? Did someone tap the line? Impossible. The nearest power grid is 80 miles away." "You should have left her on the mountain," the voice continued, slow and steady. "It would have been cleaner." My blood ran cold. The accident. The hiker I found too late, the one the police thought I was responsible for. No one knew I was here. No one knew this detail. I ripped the radio off the shelf and threw it across the room. It hit the far wall with a deafening crash and splintered open, batteries and plastic flying everywhere. The voice stopped. I stood in the center of the shack, breathing hard, shivering violently. It was over. The hallucination was gone. I was alone again. I spent an hour cleaning up the pieces, sweating with fear and relief. I threw the ruined parts into the stove, watching the plastic melt and curl into black smoke. I finally settled back into my cot, convincing myself the stress had just broken me. Then at 3:17 a.m. I heard the sound outside. It was faint, coming from the window side, a quick sharp scratch, like a fingernail on glass. I crept to the window, avoiding the loose floorboards. I pressed my face to the cold pane and peered out into the black. I could see the faint outline of the rise, the deep shadows of the bare-limbed trees. Nothing moved. Just a fox, a raven. I turned away, trying to dismiss it, but as I did, I heard it again, closer this time. Scratch, 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 3 quick, deliberate sounds. I turned back, adrenaline flooding my system. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass. And then, a tiny cloud of condensation appeared on the outside of the window, right in the center. It looked exactly like a circle of warm breath on the frozen glass. It grew rapidly, obscuring a small part of my view. And scrawled into the mist, traced with a fingernail or a thin branch, were 3 letters, HID. HID as in hidden. I stumbled backward, knocking over my coffee thermos. I didn't see a person. I didn't hear a footstep, just the breath and the writing. I threw myself against the door, wrenching the heavy bolt shut. They're outside. They know my name, they know my past, and they can write on my window without me seeing them. I grabbed the only tool I had left, a heavy axe I used for splitting wood. I backed into the darkest corner of the shack, the cold steel of the axe handle burning my glove. I waited. The silence returned, heavy and mocking. I was trapped in a tiny box, waiting for the invisible thing to strike. An hour passed, 2. The sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours. I realized the danger wasn't just physical, it was the waiting. They wanted me to break. I decided I wouldn't wait, I would move. I crept to the back wall where I kept my pack. My eyes never left the front door. I grabbed my gear, pulling my warmest layers on. I was leaving the shack. I preferred the dark, open tundra to this tiny, claustrophobic prison. As I zipped my parka, I heard a terrible, grating sound. It wasn't outside. It was coming from underneath me. The sound of metal dragging on stone, heavy, slow. They weren't trying to break in. They were digging or moving something massive. I dropped my pack and carefully knelt down, peering into the shadows under the wood stove. The ground under the shack was mostly frozen dirt and gravel, but right there, near the foundation log, the dirt looked recently disturbed, and poking up from the loose, dark soil was a section of heavy chain, rusted and thick. I dropped the axe and started digging with my bare hands. The soil was loose, easy to move. A few minutes later, I uncovered a steel hatch, square, bolted down about 3 feet wide. My mind raced. What is this? An old well, a root cellar. The chain I had seen was looped around the edge of the hatch. The end of the chain disappeared into the darkness, further underneath the shack. I looked at the hatch. It was secured by 4 massive, ancient bolts. Did they just find this, or did they just finish locking it? I reached out and touched the steel. It was ice cold. I started pulling on the chain, gently at first, then with all my strength. It was heavy, but it moved. It slid out from under the shack, inch by agonizing inch, until the end of the chain appeared in my grasp. And attached to the end of the chain, tied with a simple, tight knot, was the weather radio. The broken pieces, the plastic chassis, the circuit board, the batteries, all tied together with the chain. The voice hadn't come from the radio. It had been amplified, piped, or broadcast from whatever was in the hatch, using the radio's shattered casing as a decoy and a terrifying calling card. My eyes shot back to the steel hatch. What did they just lock in there? Or what did they just lock me out of? I grabbed the heavy axe and, trembling, raised it high over my head. I brought it down with a desperate, ringing crash onto the steel hatch. The metal didn't break, it only echoed. But in the wake of the sound, a new sound came from deep inside the shack, a low, muffled chuckle. Not from the hatch, not from outside, but from the corner near the empty shelves. I spun around, axe raised, my heart about to explode. I was alone. The shelves were empty, but etched into the dry interior wood of the top shelf in thick black pencil was a single, fresh, final sentence. "The shack is the least of your problems, Noah. Look at your feet." I lowered my gaze. I looked down at the floorboards right under my boots. The boards were old, rough, and dirty, but one of them, the one I had been standing on while I was listening to the voice, was missing its nails. It wasn't a hallucination. They weren't just outside. They had been in the shack the whole time, maybe hiding under the floor, maybe watching me clean up the radio, waiting for the right moment. I didn't stop to think. I kicked the loose board out of the way, plunged the axe into the dirt below, and hoisted myself down into the frozen crawlspace. I crawled on my belly blindly until I was outside the shack's perimeter. I didn't run until I felt the rising sun, weak and pale, touch my face. I left the axe, the shack, and the terrifying empty space behind me. The police never caught me, but the silence did. And I never forgot the sound of the chain, or the knowledge that the greatest danger was always the space I thought was safest. Story 7. My name is Finn. I'm a commercial diver, but the kind of diving I do here on Kodiak Island in the dead of winter isn't for salvage or oil. It's for desperation. We were pulling crab pots abandoned by bankrupt fishermen, pots stuck miles out under the volatile, frozen surface. The job was run by a cheap, grizzled man named Anton, and the tender vessel was an old tugboat, the Northern Lights, that felt like it was ready to sink just by looking at it. The crew was just me, Anton, and a deckhand named Ray, a nervous kid who spent too much time staring at the black water. The tension wasn't from the cold. We were used to that. It was from the silence. You're floating on a massive, heavy skin of ice miles from shore, and the only sounds are the crack of the shifting ice and the dull thrum of the tug's ancient engine. It was night, of course, 1 a.m. The water is clearer then, and Anton liked the cover of darkness for his shady operation. I was already suited up, heavy helmet locked down, air hissing steadily into the mask. 30 minutes down, Finn, Anton's voice crackled in my comms, flat and hard. The pot is 120 feet. Don't waste my oxygen. Copy that, Anton, I replied, my voice sounding tinny and far away even to myself. I stood on the diving platform, looking at the hole we'd cut in the ice. It was a perfect, black square surrounded by the smooth, white expanse, It looked like a hole punched into the void. I descended into the black water. The light from the surface vanished instantly. I turned on my primary lamp. The beam was swallowed by the cold, dark silt and plankton soup. Click, I felt the pressure gauge on my chest. A small plastic tab. Click as I sank deeper. At 80 feet, I saw the lights. Not my own lamp, but two small, steady points of bluish light, maybe 30 feet below me and off to the left. They weren't moving, just stationary, waiting. Anton, I keyed the comms. I've got lights. Small, steady, could be a wreck marker or... Ignore it, Finn, Anton snapped back, cutting me off. You're 40 feet above the pot. Stay on the line. I descended further, but my eyes were fixed on the blue lights. As I passed 100 feet, the silt cleared enough for me to see them better. They weren't markers. They were the headlamps of another diver. The diver was kneeling on the silty bottom, his back to me. He was wearing heavy, dark gear that blended into the mud. He wasn't moving, just kneeling, motionless, his two small lights cutting tunnels through the water. Anton, I have a diver at the same depth. He's not moving. A longer pause this time. Anton's voice was tight when he returned. Listen to me, Finn. You are the only diver on that manifest. You see nothing. You recover the pot. Now. I knew Anton was lying. Someone else was down here. I kept my distance, creeping toward the crab pot, a massive wire cage almost hidden in the gloom. I reached it and started securing the lift line. As I did, I finally got a better look at the kneeling diver. His helmet was tilted down. His umbilical line, the life-giving hose providing air and comms, was cut. Not frayed or broken, but cleanly sliced maybe 3 feet above his back. It trailed behind him like a dead snake. He's dead. My hands started shaking, sending small plumes of silt into the water. The fear was instant and absolute. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. Someone had deliberately cut a diver's lifeline. And then the diver moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head. He didn't turn around. He just tilted his helmet back to stare straight up into the blackness above him, where the tugboat Northern Lights floated. My breath hitched. How is he moving without air? I focused my lamp on his faceplate. The light hit the glass, and instead of reflecting, it seemed to pass through it. I could see the diver's face inside the helmet. It was pale, slack, with eyes wide open, staring at the surface, but his lips were moving. He wasn't speaking, he was mouthing. I adjusted my helmet comms frequency, trying to filter out Anton's static. Maybe he was trying to signal. I leaned closer, fighting the panic. The lips were moving in an agonizingly slow rhythm. I strained to understand. He wasn't asking for help. He was mouthing 3 words over and over. He's behind you. My entire body locked up. I knew the danger wasn't the dead man. It was the man who killed him. Anton, someone else is down here. I need to come up now. I screamed into the comms. Anton's voice was a flat, cold lie. Finn, I see you. You're fine, keep working, you're getting jumpy. He's covering for whoever is here. I didn't wait. I released the lift line and grabbed the primary descent rope, pulling myself up as fast as I dared without risking the bends. As I ascended, I glanced back down. The dead diver was still kneeling, still mouthing his silent warning. And then the second lamp appeared. It flashed once, sharply, from the dark perimeter, maybe 20 feet behind where I had been working. It was a powerful, focused beam. It swept across the bottom and settled directly onto the pot where I had just been standing. The beam tracked slowly along the silt path I had made, following my frantic ascent line. I was 40 feet up. I had to go faster. The voice of the dead diver, the one I had just seen mouthing the words, suddenly screamed in my helmet comms. It wasn't Anton's voice or my own. It was wet, gurgling, and utterly terrifying. The air is poisoned. A high-pitched, piercing scream cut through the sound. It wasn't the dead diver. It was Ray, the nervous kid on the deck. Then Anton's comms came alive, a roar of panic and fury. "Ray, shut up. What was that, Finn? Get back to the pot now." I was at 10 feet, almost at the ice line. I could see the faint glow of the tug's hull above me. I pulled myself through the hole and scrambled onto the platform, tearing the heavy helmet off my head. I didn't wait for Anton. Ray was huddled by the railing, pointing a shaking finger at the tug's engine room hatch. He was weeping. He went in with the tank," Ray stammered. "Who went in? What tank?" I shouted, ripping off my dive gloves. "The Northern Lights, she's running on a mix." Anton emerged from the wheelhouse, his face gray with terror and sweat. He was holding a rusted pipe wrench. "The reserve tank. He put something in the reserve tank. The air is poisoned." The blue light from the deep, the silent diver, the severed line. It wasn't just a trap for me. It was a cover. While I was down deep and distracted, the killer had climbed onto the Northern Lights and gotten to the air lines. And then I understood Ray's scream. Ray wasn't screaming because the man went into the engine room. He was screaming because of what he took. I looked down at the platform. The heavy auxiliary air tank, the one Anton used for emergency surface air, was missing from its rack. And then a thin, sickly sweet smell. Similar to the one in Story 5, but mixed with something acrid, started wafting out of the engine room hatch. Anton looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. Ray's air, his surface air, it's tied into the reserve. The killer hadn't just sabotaged the air. He was using a separate auxiliary tank, filled with poison, and pumping it directly into the boat's ventilation or the deckhand's surface air lines. Ray was panicking because he had just breathed a lungful of it. I grabbed Anton's pipe wrench. The other man, the dead diver, who was he? Anton collapsed against the railing, defeated. He was a partner. We found too many pots. He wanted more. We dealt with him. Crime horror, not a monster but men. And the sea had held their victim, only to give him back as a warning. I looked at the engine room hatch. The poison smell was getting stronger. The killer was inside, sealing himself off, waiting for the toxic air to force us out. I didn't bother with the hatch. I dragged Ray to the main deck, away from the vents. I grabbed the emergency VHF radio from the wheelhouse. The nearest Coast Guard was an hour away. I looked at Anton. He was clutching his chest, the wrench falling to the deck. His face was losing color fast. He had breathed too much of it. I wasn't saving him. I was saving myself. I opened the VHF channel and started broadcasting a frantic SOS, giving our coordinates. As I spoke, a loud, muffled clanging started from beneath the deck, directly below the wheelhouse. He's not waiting for the poison to work. He's going to scuttle the boat. I slammed the microphone down. I grabbed 2 survival suits and tossed one to the half-conscious Ray. I didn't waste one more second on the Northern Lights. I wrestled Ray into the suit and then pulled mine on. I threw the single remaining flare gun into my pocket. I pushed the heavy rubber inflatable dinghy over the railing and into the hole in the ice. As I pulled Ray's limp body over the edge, the tug's engine gave one final choking cough and then died. The lights flickered, plunged the deck into momentary darkness, and then died too. I pushed off the tug and pulled Ray clear, scrambling onto the ice sheet. I looked back. In the absolute silent blackness, the Northern Lights was sinking, slow and steady, listing hard to starboard. There were no lights, no sounds of anyone trying to escape. I lit the flare. The red glow cut across the ice. I dragged Ray further onto the massive, frozen expanse. As the tug went under, leaving only a widening black wound in the ice, I knew the killer had chosen his own fate, sinking with his boat, with his victim's body still down below, and with the man who helped him kill as the final passengers. I was alone, miles from shore on a sheet of ice with a poisoned man. But the water was quiet now. The boat was gone, and the terrible pressure of the deep was finally off my chest. Story 8. My name is Clara. I'm a cartographer, and 2 weeks ago, I was dropped off by float plane on a remote lake in the heart of the Alaska Range. My job: verify old survey points that hadn't been checked since the 1950s. The pay was great, but the isolation was absolute. The nearest known permanent structure was 100 miles south. I was living in a bright orange canvas tent, surrounded by a wall of spruce trees so dense they blocked out half the sky. My only connection was a fixed-wing radio for the daily check-in with the pilot, Ted. The first few days were fine, cold but fine. Then on day 5 the voices started. It was 4 a.m., total darkness. I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't place, a muffled, distant noise. Not an animal, not the wind. It sounded like people shouting. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flap. I stood there, listening hard, clutching the small bear spray canister. The sound came again, yelling, a confused, overlapping chorus of maybe 3 or 4 voices carried on the cold, sharp air. They were angry, distressed, and sounded like they were fighting. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't echoing off the mountains, it was dead. Flat, as if the shouting was happening inside a thick burlap sack, or worse, deep underground. Who would be out here? A lost trekking party. I lit a lantern and tried my radio. Ted, this is Clara, do you read? I need a location check. I think I have people nearby. Only static crackled back. Ted was out of range for the night. I waited for the screaming to start again, but it didn't. Just silence, heavy and mocking. The next night it was worse. I was trying to read by the light of my headlamp when the sound returned at 1:35 a.m. It wasn't yelling this time. It was crying. A woman's high-pitched, desperate sobbing interspersed with a man's low, ragged moaning. The tent fabric felt suddenly thin, useless. I knew I couldn't walk toward it. The taiga forest is a tangled, broken mess of deadfall and swamp. I would be lost in minutes. I pressed my ear against the tent fabric, trying to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to come from directly downhill, toward the frozen lake edge, maybe half a mile away. The crying went on for 10 agonizing minutes. It felt so close, so real, that I almost unzipped the tent and ran. Then the crying cut off abruptly, replaced by a horrible sharp crack, like a heavy bone snapping, and then silence. I didn't sleep again. I didn't try the radio. I was paralyzed by a terror that had no shape, no name. On day 7, the truth, or what I thought was the truth, came with the light. I was boiling water for coffee when I saw it. A small, white ribbon tied to the lowest branch of a spruce tree, maybe 50 feet from my camp. It hadn't been there before. It was synthetic, the kind used for marking survey lines, but it was bright white. I walked toward it, my rifle held loosely at my side. As I got closer, I saw that the ribbon wasn't just tied. It was knotted in a specific, sailor's knot, a figure 8. The kind of knot you use when you want something to stay absolutely, permanently fixed. I untied it, my fingers numb, and then I saw the ground right below the branch. The soil was covered in a thick layer of moss and pine needles, but someone had taken a small, sharp instrument and etched into the soft ground, scraping away the moss to leave a message. It was a single word carved into the earth: lies. Lies. My survey job was based on 50-year-old data. Were the old maps wrong? Or was this a warning about me? I looked back at my tent. The isolation felt like a trap now, one that had snapped shut. That evening I got Ted on the radio. His voice was choppy, but I could hear him. Ted, I need you to pull me out tomorrow. I'm done. I'm seeing things, hearing things. Clara, the weather's holding. I can't spare the fuel. Give me 4 more days, Ted crackled. What are you hearing? I hesitated. Just people fighting near the lake. Ted paused and the static went quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very low. Clara, look up the taiga murmur. It's the pressure. It happens out there, forget it. He clicked off before I could respond. I tried to call him back, but the static was an impenetrable wall. I did look it up later that night, using the sat link on my GPS unit, the one thing I was sworn not to touch for anything but emergency. The taiga murmur, a documented psychological phenomenon in extreme isolation, where the silence is so profound, the brain fabricates voices, often of people screaming or fighting, to fill the void. A coping mechanism that turns deadly. It's my mind breaking. The thought was a terrible relief and a new terror all at once. I sat in the tent, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, listening to the wind, trying to force myself to believe the taiga murmur was real. Then at 11:58 p.m., the silence broke. But it wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a single, clear tune. A music box tune. A simple childhood melody, Pop Goes the Weasel. It was coming from right outside the tent door. It wasn't a hallucination. The melody was sharp, metallic, and painfully real. Tink, tink, tink. I slowly pulled the hammer off my utility belt. My mind was screaming one single thought. If it was my mind, why is it playing a song I know? The music stopped, and then a sound that wasn't a voice and wasn't music. A slow, heavy scrape on the canvas right beside my head. Like a piece of metal dragging against the tent fabric. Screek. Then the scraping stopped. A single, thick finger pushed through the canvas, right beside my head. It tore a jagged 4-inch slit in the heavy fabric. The finger was encased in a filthy, dark brown leather glove. It wiggled once, testing the air. And then it pulled out, and through the tiny slit, a piece of something white was pushed in. I grabbed the lantern and held it up to the slit. Lying on the floor of my tent was the music box, tiny, wooden, painted with faded clowns. And tied to the winding key was a small, synthetic white ribbon, the same knot, the same fabric. I didn't open the box. I didn't touch the ribbon. I knew if I stayed, the taiga murmur would turn real, permanent, and fatal. I grabbed my pack, ripped a massive slit in the back of the tent with my knife, and scrambled out into the night. I ran, not toward the lake but uphill, toward the solid, impassive bulk of the mountains. I didn't stop until I saw the first faint, silver light of dawn on the peaks. I found an outcropping of rock and huddled there, freezing, until Ted's plane circled overhead hours later. I never told him about the ribbon or the music box, but as I strapped into the plane, I looked back at the tiny orange dot of my camp. And I saw, clearly carved deep into the side of the wooden float plane ski, another message, fresh and deep, shining in the morning light. You didn't listen, CLARA. I closed my eyes. The voices of the taiga murmur were gone, but the paranoia had found its shape, and it was sitting right behind me. I had survived the wilderness, but I knew I wouldn't survive the memories. The silence was broken, and the truth was I wasn't alone. I never was.